sentenced to death behind closed doors for the crime of predatory hunting, yet buried the next day in the glorious honor of a national hero. He was Lord Lewis Harcourt, an indispensable pillar and foundational architect of the vast colonial machinery of the British Empire. Why did the elite power structure exploit his sudden death to silence a sensational blackmail scandal, transforming a heinous threat into a revered saint? Lewis Harcourt was not merely a participant in the British government. He was an apex predator in the ecosystem of imperial control. Born into the deep arterial wealth of the Liberal Party establishment, his pedigree was flawless. He did not have to claw his way up through the grimy ranks of local politics or shout for attention in the chaotic chambers of the House of Commons. Power was his birthright, handed down through generations of men who believed they were divinely appointed to map the world. Known intimately to his peers as Lulu, he cultivated an aura of languid supremacy. He was a man of terrifying refinement. His collars were stiff, his bespoke suits cut with razor precision by Savile Row tailors, and his voice rarely rose above a calm, conversational murmur. Yet that quiet murmur could end a career or launch a dreadnought. He was the ultimate backroom operator, the invisible hand that guided the visible machinery of state. For 5 crucial years, from 1910 to 1915, Harcourt held the office of Secretary of State for the colonies. This title, inscribed in gold on the door of his vast Whitehall office, fails to capture the godlike authority of the position. Seated behind a massive mahogany desk, Harcourt stared down at a map of the world where fully 1/4 of the landmass was colored imperial red. He was the absolute master over millions of souls who would never see his face. His daily correspondence involved the suppression of tribal rebellions in the Gold Coast, the extraction of rubber from Malaya, the management of vast penal colonies, and the delicate balancing of trade routes through the Suez Canal. He received daily red leather dispatch boxes filled with the highest classifications of state secrets. When he issued an order, governors general bowed, admirals repositioned fleets, and entire colonial economies pivoted. He was the administrative heart of an empire that boasted the sun never set upon its borders. The men who held this office were expected to possess a moral architecture as solid and impenetrable as the Bank of England. They were the physical embodiment of British civilization, projecting an image of stoic, unyielding, Victorian righteousness to the rest of the world. The physical environment he inhabited was a closed, hermetically sealed fortress of privilege. His days were a choreographed procession between spaces of absolute exclusivity. He moved from the hushed, leather-scented libraries of the Reform Club to the Gothic, echoing halls of the Palace of Westminster, and finally to the opulent, glittering dining rooms of high society. The Edwardian era, straddling the turn of the 20th century, was a period of staggering wealth inequality and rigid social stratification. The ruling class numbered only in the few thousands, a tight-knit web of interconnected families who went to the same elite boarding schools, married each other's cousins, and guarded their collective reputation with ruthless brutality. In this world, perception was not merely important, it was the only currency that truly mattered. A man could be utterly incompetent, privately cruel, or financially ruined, and the system would quietly absorb the blow, hiding him away in a minor diplomatic post or a country estate. The unforgivable sin, the only crime that carried a sentence of social death, was exposure. Bringing a scandal into the harsh light of public scrutiny threatened the fragile illusion of aristocratic superiority. It gave ammunition to the rising tide of socialism, to the increasingly vocal working classes who were beginning to demand a share of the wealth they produced. The elite lived in a state of constant low-level paranoia, terrified of any crack in their marble facade. Harcourt's position at the absolute pinnacle of this fragile pyramid was cemented by his relationship with the crown. He was not just a minister, he was a courtier of the highest order. He had been a favored companion of the hedonistic King Edward VII, moving effortlessly through the opulent, champagne-soaked weekend shooting parties at Sandringham. When Edward died, and the far more austere, rigidly conservative George V ascended the throne, Harcourt seamlessly adapted. He became an indispensable confidant to the new king, a regular and highly valued guest at Buckingham Palace. Dining with the king was not a casual affair. It was a deeply coded ritual of proximity and favor. The seating arrangements, the topics of conversation deemed acceptable, the subtle nods of approval, these were the mechanics of supreme influence. Harcourt mastered them all. He possessed the rare ability to deliver bad political news to the monarch while making it sound like a temporary, manageable inconvenience. He was the buffer between the harsh realities of a changing world and the insulated, velvet-lined reality of the royal family. Because of this, he was considered untouchable. He was draped in the ultimate protective cloak of royal patronage. To attack Lulu was to risk the wrath of the sovereign himself. This illusion of invulnerability was further fortified by his private wealth. Harcourt did not rely on a government salary. His lifestyle was funded by a vast fortune, significantly augmented by his strategic marriage to Mary Burns, an American heiress whose family wealth derived from the monolithic financial empire of J.P. Morgan. The infusion of American industrial capital into the veins of British aristocratic lineage created a hybrid power structure of terrifying scale. Together, they presided over Nunningham House, a sprawling, monumental country estate in Oxfordshire. Nunningham was not merely a home, it was a political headquarters, a theater designed to intimidate and awe. Weekend parties at the estate were carefully curated assemblies of prime ministers, foreign ambassadors, and industrial magnates. The manicured gardens, the armies of silent servants, the endless flow of vintage wines, all of it was deployed as a weapon of soft power. Harcourt stood at the center of this opulent vortex, the gracious host, the generous benefactor, the man who seemingly lacked nothing and feared no one. He had built an architecture of power so dense, so layered with financial, political, and royal protection, that he appeared immune to the laws of consequence that governed ordinary men. Yet the foundations of this fortress were built on a fault line of profound hypocrisy. The Edwardian ruling class operated under a dual moral code, a system of breathtaking double standards. Publicly, they championed an atmosphere of strict Christian morality, enforcing harsh laws against obscenity, moral deviance, and any behavior that deviated from the rigidly defined norms of the traditional family. They sent men to hard labor in freezing prison for infractions of public decency. They ruined the careers of military officers and civil servants for the slightest hint of scandal. The law was a blunt instrument used to control the masses and maintain social order. Privately, however, Within the locked doors of their country estates and the soundproofed rooms of their London clubs, the rules simply did not apply to them. The aristocracy tolerated a staggering degree of moral flexibility among their own ranks, provided, and this was the absolute unbreakable covenant, that the behavior remained entirely invisible to the lower classes. This environment cultivated a dangerous arrogance in men like Harcourt. Decades of operating above the law, of having their indiscretions quietly managed by loyal fixers and discreet servants, bred a fatal sense of security. They began to believe their own mythology. They confused the silence of their peers with genuine invincibility. Harcourt moved through his life carrying secrets that, in any other context, would have resulted in immediate arrest and public ruination. He carried these secrets into the chambers of Parliament, into the colonial offices, and into the dining rooms of the king. He believed the armor of his class was impenetrable. He relied on the fundamental assumption that his peers would always prioritize the survival of their caste over the exposure of one of their own. This assumption held true during the golden sunlit years of the Edwardian summer. But the world was shifting beneath their feet. The devastating slaughter of the First World War had ripped away the illusions of aristocratic competence. Millions of young men had been ordered to their deaths in the mud of Flanders by the very same gentlemen who now sat in Whitehall. The deference of the public was evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard cynicism. The press, while still largely respectful, was beginning to realize the commercial value of exposing the hypocrisy of the ruling class. The political climate of the early 1920s was volatile, dangerous, and deeply unforgiving. The old mechanisms of control were beginning to rust. The elite were no longer universally loved. They were merely tolerated, and their hold on power was increasingly precarious. It was in this specific, highly charged atmosphere of post-war anxiety that the rumors surrounding Lewis Harcourt began to solidify into something far more dangerous than drawing room gossip. For years, the whispers had been vague, easily dismissed by his allies as the jealous mutterings of political rivals. But the whispers began to acquire a chilling specificity. They were no longer confined to vague insinuations about his private tastes. They began to attach themselves to specific locations, specific dates, and, most terrifyingly, specific names of other individuals within the upper echelons of society. The protective fog that had shielded him for decades was slowly burning away, exposing the stark, undeniable architecture of his hidden life. The realization of this impending exposure did not arrive in a sudden flash of dramatic confrontation. It arrived slowly, insidiously, like a creeping frost. Harcourt, a master reader of the political weather, would have noticed the subtle shifts in temperature, the sudden silence when he entered a room at the Reform Club, the slightly averted gaze of a longtime ally in the corridors of Westminster, the polite but firm decline of an invitation to Nuneham House by a family that would previously have leaped at the opportunity. The network of protection, the invisible web of favors and mutual defense that he had spent his entire life cultivating, was beginning to meticulously, deliberately detach itself from him. He was becoming biologically toxic to the establishment. As the winter of 1921 bled into the early, freezing months of 1922, the isolation became absolute. He was a man accustomed to the constant hum of power, the endless stream of subordinates, seeking his approval, the heavy responsibility of moving armies and shaping economies. Now he found himself trapped in the hollow, echoing chambers of his own wealth, staring into a void of impending social annihilation. The man who had managed the crises of an empire was utterly unequipped to manage the crisis of his own existence. He had spent his life treating people as pieces on a chessboard, maneuvering them to secure the advantage of the crown. Now the chessboard was tilting, the pieces were sliding away, and he realized with cold, paralyzing clarity that in the ultimate calculus of the British establishment, he was not the player. He was merely a piece, and the game was demanding a sacrifice. The mechanics of Lewis Harcourt's eventual destruction were forged in the exact same fires that built his supremacy. He was a carefully constructed instrument of the British political elite, a man whose entire psychological framework was designed around the acquisition, hoarding, and deployment of secret information. He was born in 1863 into an environment where political power was treated as a family heirloom. His father, Sir William Harcourt, was a combative, highly visible titan of the Liberal Party, a man who served as Home Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Sir William relished the brutal theater of parliamentary debate, dominating the House of Commons with a booming voice and an aggressive confrontational intellect. Lewis possessed an entirely different, far more lethal set of political instincts. Plagued by fragile health in his youth, he avoided the grueling physical demands of public campaigning and the raw, unpredictable energy of the electoral trail. He recognized early on that true, unshakable power rarely shouts from a podium. True power whispers in the corridors. Rather than stepping immediately into the glaring light of public office, he chose the shadows. For 2 decades, spanning the late 1880s and 1890s, he served as his father's private secretary. This title severely understates the reality of his position. He was the unsalaried mastermind of the Liberal Party's inner workings. As his father's health fluctuated and his political battles intensified, Lewis became the ultimate gatekeeper. He controlled access to the Chancellor. He read the highly classified memoranda before they reached the cabinet table. Most crucially, he became the repository for the party's deepest, most damaging secrets. He learned exactly how the ugly machinery of democracy was oiled by aristocratic patronage. He arranged the quiet trading of titles for financial contributions. He managed the delicate suppression of scandals that threatened to ruin key allies. He observed with cold clinical detachment the precise vulnerabilities of the men who ran the British Empire. He discovered that every man had a price, every politician had a hidden liability, and every crisis could be managed if the correct leverage was applied behind closed doors. This prolonged apprenticeship in the dark arts of political maneuvering created a specific psychological profile. Harcourt developed the absolute, unwavering conviction that he could control any narrative. He viewed political life not as a clash of grand ideologies, but as a complex logistical puzzle involving leverage, blackmail, and strategic silence. He was the classic backroom fixer. When he finally deemed it necessary to formalize his power, he entered the House of Commons in 1904, representing Rossendale. His entry was less a hard-fought democratic victory and more an inevitable coronation by the party machinery he had helped build. In the House, he was known for a languid, impeccably tailored presence. He rarely lost his temper. He dispatched political opponents not with fiery rhetoric, but with cold, heavily researched administrative detail, often delivered with a devastating aristocratic sneer. His administrative brilliance was rewarded in 1905 when he was appointed First Commissioner of Works. He used this seemingly bureaucratic role to embed himself even deeper into the social fabric of London's elite. He patronized the arts, oversaw the expansion of public spaces, and curated a vast network of influence that bridged the worlds of hard politics, high finance, and cultural patronage. He was positioning himself not merely as a politician, but as an indispensable pillar of the establishment itself. This meticulous empire building culminated in 1910 when Prime Minister H. Asquith appointed him Secretary of State for the colonies. Harcourt's tenure at the colonial office represents the zenith of his administrative clinical approach to power. He was handed the management of a global mechanism of extraction and control. He approached the British Empire exactly as an Edwardian aristocrat approached the management of a vast country estate. The colonies were assets to be maximized, unruly populations to be disciplined, and geopolitical borders to be secured against rival European powers. He sat behind a desk in Whitehall, thousands of miles away from the brutal realities of colonial subjugation, and moved human lives across the map with the stroke of a pen. He oversaw the fraught, complex consolidation of the Union of South Africa, navigating the bitter racial and political divides left in the wake of the Boer War. He managed the sprawling, chaotic expansion of British administration across East and West Africa, prioritizing economic efficiency and the smooth extraction of resources over any sentimental notions of local autonomy. He was entirely disconnected from the physical violence inherent in the empire he managed. For Harcourt, a rebellion in a distant province was not a human tragedy. It was a disruption in the supply chain, a logistical error that required the deployment of troops and the swift suppression of dissenting voices. He was a master of the institutional cover-up on a global scale. If a colonial governor was implicated in a financial irregularity, Harcourt arranged the quiet, honorable retirement to prevent embarrassment to the crown. If a military officer committed an atrocity that threatened to provoke questions in Parliament, Harcourt ensured the report was heavily redacted and buried within an obscure closed-door committee. He perfected the art of making damaging information disappear. He believed unconditionally in the efficacy of the system to protect its own, provided the problem was managed with discretion and absolute ruthlessness. This constant daily exercise of supreme unaccountable power deepened his fatal blind spot. He had spent his entire adult life building firewalls to protect the government and his allies from the consequences of their actions. He had dug the graves for the buried scandals of the Liberal Party. He operated under the deeply ingrained assumption that the rules of moral accountability applied strictly to the lower classes and the colonized populations, never to the architects of the system itself. He confused his ability to manipulate the machinery of state with personal invincibility. He believed he was the orchestrator, the man who decided who survived the political meat grinder and who was quietly discarded. The impending disaster of early 1922 was rooted in this exact miscalculation. The crisis that would eventually kill him did not come from a political misstep, a failed colonial policy, or a public electoral defeat. The threat bypassed the massive fortified walls of his public career and struck directly at the vulnerable, carefully hidden core of his private life. The skills he had honed over decades, the backroom deal, the suppressed file, the leverage applied against a political subordinate, were suddenly, terrifyingly useless. A fixer cannot negotiate his way out of a structural collapse when the foundations of his own life are the ones giving way. He had mastered the art of silencing others, but as the rumors surrounding his conduct at Eaton and within the private clubs of London began to solidify into hard, undeniable evidence held by his social equals, he found himself facing an adversary he could not intimidate. He was staring into the cold, unforgiving machinery of an establishment that was preparing to apply the very same tactics of erasure he had perfected against him. The architecture of Lewis Harcourt's impending destruction was intrinsically tied to the very elements that had made him appear invincible: his marriage and his money. To the outside observer, his union with Mary Burns in 1899 was the crowning achievement of a meticulously planned life. Mary was not merely a wealthy woman, she was a structural pillar of transatlantic financial power. As the niece of the American banking titan J. Pierpont Morgan, she brought with her a fortune of staggering proportions. This was the era of the dollar princesses, a period when the fading land-rich but cash-poor aristocracies of Europe actively traded their ancient titles and political access for the raw, explosive industrial capital of the United States. Harcourt, however, was already politically powerful. The Morgan money did not buy him a seat at the table. It bought him the entire room. The infusion of this vast American wealth allowed him to operate with absolute financial impunity. He did not need to court political donors. He did not need to compromise on his legislative agendas to secure funding, and he did not need to rely on the traditional, slow-moving patronage of the Liberal Party. He was a self-funded political sovereign. This financial absolute power was physically manifested in Nuneham House, the Harcourt family seat in Oxfordshire. Under Lewis's direction, fueled by Mary's inheritance, the estate was transformed into a monument of Edwardian excess and political theater. Nuneham was not a sanctuary, it was a heavily fortified social command center. The house was expanded, the already massive gardens were redesigned with obsessive geometric precision, and the guest lists were curated with the ruthless calculation of a military campaign. Prime ministers, foreign dignitaries, and royalty walked the manicured lawns, surrounded by an army of silent, perfectly trained servants. Every dinner party was a diplomatic summit. Every weekend shoot a negotiation over the future of the empire. Harcourt was the undisputed master of this domain. He controlled the lighting, the seating arrangements, the flow of the vintage champagne, and, by extensit, ion, the flow of national policy. Nuneham House projected an image of eternal, unshakable stability. It was designed to overwhelm the senses and instill a deep instinctual deference in anyone who passed through its iron gates. Yet this magnificent fortress was simultaneously the perfect trap. The sheer scale of Harcourt's public profile meant that he possessed no mechanism for a quiet retreat. A minor politician could perhaps weather a localized scandal, weathering the storm in a modest townhouse until the press lost interest. Harcourt had no such luxury. He was tethered to the Morgan financial empire, to the innermost circles of the British monarchy, and to the highest echelons of global diplomacy. A scandal involving the master of Nuneham House would not be a localized fire. It would be a transatlantic conflagration. The wealth and visibility that insulated him from the daily frictions of ordinary political life also guaranteed that any fall from grace would be absolute, spectacular, and utterly devastating. He had built his life on a stage illuminated by arc lights, and now as the shadows of his private conduct began to lengthen, he realized he could not find the switch to turn them off. The precise nature of the threat that began to encircle him in the early weeks of 1922 struck at the very heart of the Edwardian establishment's deepest anxieties. The rumors that had long shadowed him within the cloistered, hyper-masculine environments of London's elite clubs were no longer abstract whispers of general moral ambiguity. The whispers had crystallized into specific, dangerous allegations regarding his conduct at Eaton College. This was the fatal escalation. Eaton was not merely a school, it was the incubator where the sons of the aristocracy were forged into the next generation of viceroys, generals, and prime ministers, the moral and intellectual bedrock of the British Empire. Accusations of sexual misconduct involving the youth of the ruling class within the wall, LS of Eaton constituted a threat that transcended the personal ruin of Lewis Harcourt. It was a direct existential assault on the perceived moral superiority of the entire aristocracy. The British elite were acutely aware of the fragile nature of their authority. The working classes were mobilizing. The horrors of the First World War had shattered the myth of aristocratic infallibility, and the specter of socialism was rising across Europe. The ruling class justified their monopoly on power through a rigidly enforced narrative of duty, honor, and unimpeachable moral character. If a scandal broke revealing that a senior cabinet minister, a close friend of the king, was exploiting the very institution designed to protect and cultivate their sons, the resulting public revulsion would not just destroy Harcourt, it threatened to delegitimize the entire social order. The establishment possessed a long, ruthless institutional memory regarding such crises. They vividly remembered the Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 and the catastrophic, highly public trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895. In both instances, the initial strategy of containment had failed, resulting in sensational trials that dragged the private vices of the upper classes through the gutters of the popular press. The resulting damage to the prestige of the aristocracy had been severe and lingering. The men who controlled the levers of power in 1922, the senior civil servants, the palace courtiers, the leaders of the conservative and liberal parties, were absolutely determined that such a public spectacle would never be permitted to happen again. The system had evolved. It had learned that the public courts were unpredictable and dangerous arenas. The new strategy for survival relied on absolute preemptive neutralization. Harcourt, having spent his life as a core component of this very machine, understood this brutal calculus better than anyone. He knew that if the allegations were forced into the light, his peers will not rally to his defense. They would instantly, and with clinical efficiency, sever him from the body politic to prevent the infection from spreading. The solidarity of the ruling class extended only as far as the maintenance of their collective reputation. Once a member became a vector for systemic ruin, he was summarily excised. The loyalty he had commanded, the favors he had distributed, the dinners he had hosted at Nuneham, all of it was instantly voided the moment he transitioned from an asset to a liability. The crisis moved from theoretical danger to immediate reality with the delivery of a fatal ultimatum. The threat did not emerge from a shadowy political cabal, but from a far more dangerous adversary, Evelyn James, the formidable mother of one of the young Eatonian victims, Edward James. Armed with absolute evidence of his predatory conduct, she was entirely immune to the immense leverage of Harcourt's wealth. She was not seeking a financial settlement. She was threatening total public exposure, facing a catastrophic trial that would drag the reputation of the ruling class into the gutter. The political establishment instantly withdrew their protection. The alternative was the immediate release of the evidence, a public criminal investigation, and the deliberate, systematic destruction of his family's name, his wife's dignity, and his own life. The psychological devastation of this moment cannot be overstated. Harcourt was a man who had never been denied, a man whose entire identity was constructed around the exercise of control. He was suddenly stripped of all agency. The vast apparatus of the British Empire, which he had commanded for years, was deaf to him. The telephone lines to Buckingham Palace were effectively cut. The heavy oak doors of the Reform Club were metaphorically locked against him. He was trapped in the sprawling gilded cage of his own townhouse on Berkeley Square. He was surrounded by priceless art, attended by liveried servants, and possessed of a fortune that could buy a small country, yet he was entirely, utterly powerless. In the final days leading up to February 23rd, the silence in the Berkeley Square residence must have been deafening. The frantic, behind-the-scenes negotiations, if any were even attempted, had clearly failed. The deadline of the ultimatum was closing in like a physical wall. Harcourt was a creature of immense pride, a man who believed in the inherent superiority of his intellect and his lineage. The prospect of standing in a criminal dock, subjected to the aggressive cross-examination of a common prosecutor, his most deeply hidden private life exposed to the jeering crowds of the London streets, was a fate worse than physical torture. It was the complete negation of everything he had spent 59 years building. The establishment had presented him with a loaded gun, beautifully wrapped in the velvet of an unspoken agreement. They would not save his life, but they would offer him the opportunity to save his reputation, provided he pulled the trigger himself. The mechanism of the ultimate cover-up had been primed. It only required his final fatal compliance. The physical reality of a political suicide within the upper echelons of 1920s British society was rarely a scene of chaotic violence. It was, instead, a profoundly administrative act. As the night of February 23, 1922, deepened around the Berkeley Square townhouse, Lewis Harcourt faced the mechanics of his own end, not with the panic of a cornered animal, but with the cold, calculating precision of a career bureaucrat organizing his final dispatch. The house would have been quiet, the servants dismissed to their quarters, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the London fog. For a man who had spent his life orchestrating the movements of an empire, this final action required total, localized control. He possessed access to a vast array of medical compounds, standard provisions in the private medicine cabinets of the wealthy for ailments ranging from insomnia to the nervous exhaustion of public life. The ingestion of a lethal overdose, if measured correctly, would mimic the sudden physiological collapse of a failing heart. It would leave no blood, no shattered glass, no undignified physical trauma that would complicate the narrative for the undertakers or the family physician. It was the only acceptable method of departure for a man of his station, a quiet, unobserved transition from political liability to tragic memory. He retired to his bedchamber, a room insulated by wealth and silence, and initiated the definitive solution to the unsolvable crisis. When the morning arrived and the body was discovered, the reaction within the household and the immediate circles of power was not one of investigative curiosity, but of rapid, synchronized containment. The discovery of a deceased cabinet minister under the shadow of an impending catastrophic scandal triggers a highly specific protocol within the British establishment. The first call is never to the Metropolitan Police. The first call is to the private family physician. In the Edwardian and post-war era, the physician to the aristocracy was not an impartial man of science duty, bound to forensic truth. He was a social peer, a trusted confidant whose primary mandate was the protection of the family's honor and the preservation of social order. Upon arriving at Berkeley Square and observing the scene, the physician would immediately understand the stakes. Whether he saw an empty vial on the nightstand or simply recognized the physical signs of acute toxicity, his professional duty was instantly superseded by his class loyalty. He recognized that demanding an autopsy, involving the coroner, and initiating a public inquest would detonate the very explosive device Harcourt had just sacrificed his life to defuse. The physician's pen scratching across the official death certificate became the first and most crucial instrument of the cover-up. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. The document was signed, stamped, and the biological truth of Lewis Harcourt's final hours was officially overwritten by a politically necessary fiction. The swiftness of the bureaucratic response was absolute, executed with the clinical precision of a military operation. In the early hours of February 24th, 1922, before the afternoon broadsheets could catch a scent of crisis, the machinery of state mourning locked into place. The family physician, operating under the rigid codes of aristocratic loyalty, signed a death certificate citing heart failure. This single stroke of a pen bypassed the legal requirement for a coroner's inquest or a police investigation, permanently sealing the physical reality of the bedroom from public scrutiny. At Buckingham Palace, King George V received the news with unspoken relief. The crown was officially safe from the taint of a sprawling, catastrophic scandal. Down in Fleet Street, the press barons, powerful men like Lord Northcliffe and Lord Beaverbrook, who dined in the exact same exclusive St. James's clubs as the deceased, asked no questions. They ordered their editors to print glowing multi-column obituaries detailing an exhausted statesman succumbing to the grueling demands of the colonial office. Simultaneously, a ruthless purge of physical evidence began. The domestic staff at the Berkeley Square townhouse and the vast Oxfordshire estate of Newnham House were bound to absolute silence by the immediate threat of dismissal and permanent blacklisting. Under the supervision of trusted aides, the grand hearths consumed decades of sensitive correspondence, turning any mention of the Blackmail ultimatum to ash before dawn. Mary Burns Harcourt, channeling the formidable weight of her vast Morgan banking inheritance, transitioned instantly from a grieving widow into the fierce, unyielding architect of his posthumous myth. She weaponized her transatlantic wealth to enforce a total queue Urantine around her husband's memory. She funded expansive memorial hospital wings and commissioned flattering, larger-than-life portraits, embedding a sanitized image into the public sphere. Behind the closed doors of London high society, she operated with clinical ruthlessness. She actively monitored the whisper networks of Mayfair and Belgravia, permanently exiling anyone from her social orbit who dared mention the rumors of a coordinated political hit or an orchestrated suicide. Her tightly controlled performance ensured the official historical record remained pristine, buying silence in an era where elite social standing was the ultimate currency. She spent the remaining 22 years of her life guarding a phantom, locked in the heavy mourning customs of the Victorian era, to visually reinforce the tragedy of a natural death. Her campaign of erasure successfully penetrated the National Archives. Today, a researcher requesting the first Viscount Harcourt's papers from the temperature-controlled vaults of the Bodleian Library at Oxford is handed a highly sophisticated fiction. The collection spans hundreds of acid-free boxes, filled with heavy leather-bound diaries and thousands of pages of administrative blueprints regarding Ugandan railways, Malayan rubber tariffs, and diplomatic pleasantries. The paper trail deliberately projects the image of an untiring civil servant. Yet the files covering the fatal winter of 1921 and the early months of 1922 are suspiciously thin. The man who was driven to suicide by his own peers is entirely absent, replaced by a paper ghost constructed of mundane bureaucratic schedules. However, a cover-up of this magnitude inevitably creates microscopic fractures. The truth bypassed official public documents, surviving instead within the private, heavily guarded diaries of his contemporaries. The narrative of heart failure was universally rejected within the smoke-filled enclaves of whites and the Reform Club. Conservative politics. Ian Leo Amory, deeply embedded in the currents of Whitehall, recorded the overwhelming consensus within the political class regarding the fatal ultimatum. Other influential figures of the era documented the sudden ostracization of Harcourt in his final weeks. These private journals, written without the expectation of immediate publication, revealed a society operating in a state of deep cognitive dissonance. They publicly mourned a statesman while privately acknowledging he had been handed a loaded weapon by the establishment itself to protect the moral facade of the ruling class. The biological and physical legacy of Lewis Harcourt eventually mirrored this bureaucratic erasure. He left behind a son, William, who inherited the tainted viscountcy and the crushing, unspoken burden of the 1922 cover-up. William lived a life defined by the long shadow of his father's sudden exit. He served the state in respectable corporate capacities, primarily within the financial sector at Morgan Grenfell, and held minor diplomatic roles. He never approached the terrifying imperial heights of the colonial office. He lacked the untouchable royal proximity his father had so fatally relied upon. The physical fortress of their power, Nuneham Courtenay, slowly succumbed to a changing world. Drained by crippling inheritance taxes, the economic devastation of the Great Depression, and the egalitarian shifts following the Second World War, the sprawling estate became impossible to maintain. It was requisitioned by the Royal Air Force during the war to house reconnaissance personnel, a stark functional shift from its days of hosting royal shooting parties. In 1948, the property was entirely sold off to Oxford University. Its grand dining rooms, where prime ministers once negotiated the fate of continents, were permanently stripped of their imperial command and repurposed as quiet academic retreats. When William died in 1979 without a male heir, the Viscountcy of Harcourt simply ceased to exist. The apex political predator who once shaped the governance of a quarter of the globe, was systematically reduced to a sanitized footnote, relegated to private club rumors, and finally dissolved into a completely extinct title.